FarmEd is the centre for farm and food education based here in the Cotswolds. Our mission is to promote regenerative agriculture and sustainable food systems through knowledge exchange, education, events, research and personal development. Our audience is broad. It is you, it is everyone, from children to families to farmers, local communities, chefs, policymakers, agronomists, influencers. We want to see you all here at FarmEd. So, hope you enjoy the podcast. Find us on social media, take a look at our website and come and join us soon at FarmEd. Welcome one and all to FarmEd Podcast 8. I'm Jonty Brunny, the manager here at FarmEd. All our podcasts are, of course, special. All our guests are special. But today we are thrilled to be joined by author, journalist and environmental campaigner George Monbiot. George may be controversial at times, but his passion for the environment and justice is something we all support and admire. So welcome, George.
Thank you, Jonty.
To add to the thrill, it's a real pleasure to be joined by 7 young farmers, foodies and environmentalists who have gathered here at FarmEd today to pose our questions to George. Welcome all and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it's really special today. We thought we'd do something a little bit different. I'm going to try and shut up today and not ask all the questions. It's going to be over to you. So let's see where we get. But first, George, how are you? How have you been through these mad COVID times?
Well, I've been self-isolating for 57 years, so it hasn't made a big difference for me. I'm very lucky in that I work from home. A huge amount of my work is research-based, and so I'm just reading a stack of scientific papers every day and writing a lot of nonsense every day, and life carries on.
So you've not got cabin fever?
I think if we lock down again this winter, I'm going to find that hard because the first few weeks when you couldn't go out very much, when luckily we were allowed to go to our allotments. I could have kissed Michael Gove when he said no, I couldn't have. But when he said you could go to your allotment, it was like, oh God, such a relief, because that was the only outlet really that I had, and if it happens again this winter, then I think I will struggle. I think we'll all struggle.
Yeah, I think we're all feeling that. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming here to FarmEd. We're all sat outside today at 2 metres. Yeah, we're not cuddling or anything, I can assure you. But one beauty of being farmers and being in a rural environment is that we can do that. We're very lucky. First question, Lucy, over to you.
Thank you. Hi George, really nice to meet you. My name is Lucy, I'm 21 and I'm studying biology at the University of Bath. With so much negativity in the news, I'd love to know what positive things you think we could take away from the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the pandemic has been horrendous. It's been horrendously handled as well. Huge numbers of unnecessary deaths, unnecessary suffering. If we'd taken a more New Zealand or South Korean or Taiwanese approach, things would have been a lot better here. But in this tragedy and horror of the pandemic, you can see a whole lot of things which in general we could do better. I mean, one thing we immediately discover is this whole story that, sorry, there's no money for that, turns out to be false. We can't have a habitable planet, it's too expensive. Sorry, we can't find homes for everybody, it's too expensive. Sorry about education, sorry about health. When they need to spend the money, they'll find the money and they'll spend the money. And just a few days ago, we had the government speculating about spending £100 billion on a universal testing system. Now, for years they've been saying, oh, you want £100 million for some environmental thing? No, it's just impossible. That would bankrupt the country. 100 billion. You can just summon it up if you want to, and that's what governments can do. And so it shows us, I think, the extent to which we've been fobbed off, but it also shows us the extent to which we can make transformative change if we want. And it shows that when people are called on to act, they will act. I mean, there's no environmental call as extreme as the call that was made on us to prevent the pandemic from spreading. You've got to stay in your homes. For the first few months, you couldn't go out except once a day for essential purposes or once a day for exercise. Now, as environmentalists, we're not calling on people to do anything so extreme. But again, we've always been told, oh, people would never accept the measures that you're calling for. Well, again, it demonstrates that actually, yeah, when people realise this is a common purpose, that we're pulling together to do something that's good for all of us, then people will step up and do that thing. But it's only because the message hasn't been transmitted clearly and loudly enough to us, and it hasn't been put in terms that, you know, basically this is do or die, which is where we are with our environmental crises. It's only because of that that we haven't felt the need to step up like that. So it shows us, I think, what we can do.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. Thank you. And that sort of leads very nicely into Sophie's question.
Hi George, I'm Sophie. I'm the events coordinator here at FarmEd, and I study geography at the University of Exeter, and I'm on a continuing journey to learn more about food and farming. So following on from Lucy's question, we've seen how fast the government has acted in response to the coronavirus pandemic. How do you think that we can act as individuals and communities to kind of encourage a similar response to the climate and food systems crisis?
Thanks, Sophie. Well, I'm glad you linked those two things, the climate and food systems crisis, because they are, as you know, very strongly linked. And it's not just climate, but it's also the soils crisis, the pollination crisis, the water crisis, the phosphate crisis. There are so many frightening issues now converging on the food system, and it seems to me that governments aren't taking them nearly seriously enough. I mean, we should be panicking about this. You know, as Greta says, you know, we should be panicking about it altogether, but particularly how are we going to feed people? And or to refine the question, how are we going to feed people without actually devouring the planet? And this is such a huge issue. You know, if you think the sight of people fighting over toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic was an ugly sight, imagine how it's going to be if people are fighting over food. And of course, you know, we know globally how that's going to resolve itself. The rich nations will grab the food and the poor will be left to starve if there's a net food deficit globally. So, and this has become my obsession really over the past couple of years, and will remain so for quite a while to come, is to find out, how can we do this? How can we reconcile these really difficult questions? Like, you know, there's going to be 9 billion people, possibly 10. The demand for protein is rising and rising with wealth, particularly the switch to animal products, which is environmentally catastrophic because there's just not enough space to accommodate all that demand. Because by and large animals require more space than plant-based foods. At the same time, somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees of global heating, we're not quite sure where, we're quite likely to see what scientists call multiple breadbasket failures happening. Simply because crops reach their thermal limits, soil moisture takes a dive off a cliff, a whole lot of other impacts begin to kick in, runaway wildfires, and the turns out the pollution that they cause has a massive impact on crop development. Then you've got all those other issues that I mentioned kicking in at the same time. I mean, the rate of soil degradation, you know, we're not completely sure what the global rate is, but we know it's dire. Everyone's saying, well, we can increase production by using more irrigation. Where's the water going to come from? Aquifers are already highly depleted in many crucial parts of the world. We're on a road to ruin on the path we're on, and we urgently need to change that path. And so really my quest is to find out how we can do that, and that's what brings me here.
So we keep hearing that we're on a track to return to normal after coronavirus, whatever normal was, but do you think we will ever go back to that normality of...
I so don't want to return to normal. I mean, normal is the road to ruin. I mean, that is the normal that we were on, and coronavirus does give us this opportunity to reset, to do a great reset, to say, okay, the economy, you know, huge parts of the economy are more or less ground to a halt. We could just try to kickstart the old economy, and they've been doing that, bailing out the airlines, bailing out the fossil fuel companies and stuff. But why? You know, if you're spending all this money, why not spend it to create a completely new economy based on green principles, based on circular principles, regenerative principles, which actually treats the Earth's systems as systems within which we are embedded, and puts as our top priority the survival of our life support systems, which by definition we kind of need. And at the moment, the top priority is just making money and growing the economy. But everything that we saw as growth and progress from an environmental perspective is just progress towards the cliff's edge.
Brilliant, thank you. We couldn't get Greta here today, but we do have our very own young William. William, what's your question?
Hi, my name's Will. I'm 18. Just about to start my degree in geography at Bristol. From your perspective, what skills and knowledge do we need to create a sustainable future?
Thanks, Will. Well, almost all of them. It's a glib response to that, because I mean this is multifaceted. We have to operate. We have to come at these massive problems we're facing with all the skill sets we can possibly muster. And we need people who can research and analyse, work out what the hell is going on and what we need to do. We need people who are good at actually doing it. And Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, I think, light a torch in that they show us how civil disobedience can actually change things quite significantly. We need technologists, we need scientists, we need experimenters of all kinds. We need people with financial knowledge, economic knowledge to get involved. It's this is a crisis in every possible dimension, and it requires all the best brains to get onto it. And one of the many problems that we face is that there's been this huge brain drain into the financial sector. And I've witnessed it myself. When I was a student, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, my friends, fellow students, for the first 2 years were all going on about these high ideals they had about, I'm going to work for Oxfam, I'm going to be an organic farmer, I'm going to be a photographer, an artist, whatever it might be. And then suddenly these city recruitment firms turn up, and it was like a giant vacuum cleaner had been turned on, and the whole lot just went straight into the city. It was shocking to see. Suddenly they just abandoned their ideals. And when I challenged them on this, they said, "Oh well, I'll just do it for a couple of years and earn the money required so that I can then do the things I really want to do." But they didn't reckon with several things, and one of those was that the first couple of years in the city is like a reorientation process. It's almost brainwashing. They work you 15, 16 hours a day until you can't think, you have no time to yourself, you aren't yourself anymore, and you just think like the corporation that you're working for. By the time you're out of that, you've lost all your ideals, you've forgotten what you were. But also you acquire a lifestyle to match your salary, and you don't want to let go of that. And then the excuses change. Well, I'll just do it till I've paid off my mortgage. I'll just do it till my kids are out of school. And after a few years, it's like that was just a student fantasy. And people are lost. People get sucked into this system and they never come out of it again. And so many of the best brains in this country get sucked into that corrupt black hole called the City of London, which basically is a gigantic money laundering operation, sucking up the world's criminal proceeds of crime and generating quite a few proceeds of crime along the way. And it's just such a terrible waste. We need all those great brains on this great task that we face. I mean, this is the biggest challenge that any generation has ever faced. Because this is a challenge which affects the survival of everyone on Earth and everything on Earth, all the other creatures that we live with. And we need, whatever our skills are, to bring that particular skill set to bear on this huge existential problem.
Thank you, George. Wonderful stuff. Question from Abby, please.
Hello, I'm Abby and I'm a young farmer and agricultural student. Small diverse farms such as the one we're at today can produce a good amount of nutritious food, including vegetables, salad, fruit, honey, cereals, eggs, meat and milk to sell to local consumers. We can integrate this with the provision of wildlife habitat, tree planting and public access. we help to protect the local communities from flooding. We can also build the soil organic matter and be low input and carbon neutral. We employ people to do rewarding work. We farm with nature here. Would you like to see more of this land sharing and a diverse regenerative approach similar to what you see here at FarmEd?
Thank you, Abby. I'm very interested in what's happening here, which is why I'm here for the second time now. I think it's really fascinating, and I mean, I've still got a lot to learn about the model here and how it's panning out. I definitely think that there is a strong argument in favour of integrated, regenerative, rotational farming of this kind. I have to say, in this country it's now very rare, though there is a new movement trying to bring it back in, because there's a centrifugal force acting on farming which pulls livestock in one direction and arable in another direction and horticulture in another direction, and so what I frequently find is people, you know, I'll get into an argument with someone about grazing in the uplands, and then finally, when that person's run out of arguments, they'll say, "Oh yeah, but rotational farming." I said, "Yeah, but that's not what you're doing. That's not what you're doing in the uplands. Where's the rotation? You know, where? Because of course you can't. You know, you can't really sensibly grow arable crops in the uplands." And I feel that in those situations, you're much better off rewilding the land, ecosystem restoration. But in a situation like this, where you can do it, I think there's a very strong argument for doing it. So that the question I've got really is the question of yield gap. How does it compare in terms of productivity? Because that has to be something that we throw into the mix if we're facing a potential global food crisis.
Yeah.
So I can see what it's doing, and I can see that it looks 100 times better than many other farms on similar land, and that there's a lot of wildlife here. There's a lot of birds, a lot of wildflowers, a lot going on. I'm sure the soil is definitely in a better state than on many other farms. Can we balance that with productivity? That's one of the questions I want to explore here. Is this a replicable model? Can it be followed up? Can it be scaled up? Do we want to scale it up? You know, that's a whole other question, because you know, the great majority of people are, well, already the majority of the world's people are living in cities. A great majority is going to be living in cities before very long at all. We will need to produce food on a very large scale and ship it in on a very large scale into cities. But that's not to say that you can't have more niche marketing at the same time. So there's just a huge number of questions here. Now, on the question of sparing versus sharing, this too intersects with the yield issue. And now there's been a lot of research into this. Generally speaking, sparing gives you richer ecosystems, not least because farmers, for obvious reasons, tend not to tolerate wolves running around through their flocks and deer eating their crops and all the other ecosystem processes which farming tries to hold at bay, because we're trying to get something out of the back end of it. Obviously, that's the whole purpose of it. So so there's, you know, so depending on the yield penalty that you might or might not get with farming like this, do we say it's better to farm with high yield on a small area and spare the rest of it for nature, or it's better, at least on some of the area, to be sharing it to the greatest possible extent with nature? And this for me is an open question. Has to be said, most of the research seems to tend towards sparing, as you're giving you those sort of rich, multi-layered, trophically layered ecosystems which are deep and wide, but you know, I would be loath to dismiss what's happening here. One word of caution is that almost everyone is now calling what they're doing regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
I call it regenerative agriculture, formerly known as agriculture. And so there's a real danger of people bandwagoning onto genuine projects like this and devaluing the coinage of it. So I think that people who are practicing what I would consider genuine regenerative agriculture, which, you know, from the little I've seen so far, it seems that this is what's happening here, have to be very careful to defend that label and stop it being hijacked by people who plainly are not practicing that. I mean, I came across a sheep farmer who I know in Wales, who visited NEP, which, as you know, is this famous example of it's rewilding. It's sort of not full trophic rewilding, but it's, you know, a small amount of food production with a large amount of wildlife. It's a pretty great project. And he comes away from it and say, well, that's exactly what I'm doing on my farm. And I've visited his farm. There's no wildlife on it at all. It's just a desert. And so it's quite easy for people to deceive themselves, easy for them to imagine that they're practicing something that they're not practicing. And, you know, I don't know where things stand, but if it's not happening, I think we need some really clear, hard and fast criteria as to what regenerative agriculture is and what it isn't, to prevent that bandwagon effect from just destroying the whole notion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Brilliant. Thank you, George. I mean, you've touched on so many important points there, and I'm glad you're on the journey with us. Yeah, we're on this same journey too, and hopefully we can solve some of those problems. Next question, Chris.
Hi, George. Last year I completed a MSc in Agritech and Innovation whilst working as a robotics engineer at an Agritech firm. Really, I'd just like your opinion on how you think Agritech might drive forward sustainable and regenerative change within our landscape, and how actually the landscape might change because of it.
Thank you, Chris. Another very interesting question. They're all great questions. So I see a lot of papers saying, you know, we don't need agri-tech, we need agroecology, or agri-tech is the way forward and the only way forward. And I just think, well, why does this have to be either or? You know, where is the clash here? Because, and actually I think sometimes it's an aesthetic thing, that people don't like to see modern machinery on a farm. They'd much prefer to see a horse and cart. And actually, you know, if we were to go all that way, horses are a really inefficient land use. You need roughly a third of your land set aside for your horses, just to fuel them with oats or barley or whatever it is that you're feeding them. And you end up farming horses as much as farming anything else. So it's like, you know, what people, it's that pastoral image, that bucolic image of what the countryside should be, which I think often holds us back. Now, obviously, I've got some idealised images in my mind, but they're about ecosystems running rampant and wolves and wonderful trophic cascades and processes taking place. They're sort of very, very rich ecologies. But I don't see those as being at all incompatible with high-tech but very careful farming. And in fact, it's quite easy to see those things going together. I mean, if you can massively reduce farm chemicals by deploying them far more carefully, if you have to deploy them at all, if you can weed mechanically with robots, if you can use remote sensing to improve the efficiency of your operation, if you can improve your plant breeds, you know, there's so many ways in which we can use high tech to reduce our environmental impacts, and they don't necessarily clash. However, there is an issue. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of issues which I haven't thought of, but one issue that does sort of niggle at me is that high tech means a lot of money, and so for small farmers it might potentially disadvantage them further as they become more leveraged, more in hock to the bank, which, as we know, has been the bane of a lot of small farmers' lives already. And I remember when robot weeding was first mooted several years ago, there was a big article saying, this is going to be fantastic for small farmers. And I was thinking, small farmers are labour rich and capital poor, by and large, you know, that as a gross generalisation, whereas large farmers tend to be labour poor and capital rich. So how is robotic weeding going to advantage the small farmer against the large farmer? Surely it's going to tilt it the other way. So I'd say, you know, let's be realistic about what the impacts are going to be. Let's have a social component when we're thinking about the impacts of high tech, as well as an ecological and production component, and just try to see it as much as possible in the round. But as a normative question, is there a clash between environmental aims and agri-tech? There is, as far as I see, no inherent clash. Obviously, there are some forms of agri-tech, like neonicotinoid pesticides, which clash directly with environmental values. But there are other forms which actually overcome the need to deploy such pesticides or to use those what should be redundant agricultural technologies. We move on to new and better ones.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. One of the ways which I think agri-tech is really going to kind of change the landscape we see is, you talked very nicely about how we'll have robots in the fields and stuff like that, but it's also the potential to reduce food miles almost to the extreme. Like, we're seeing agri-tech being used in abandoned London Underground stations to grow food beneath people. We're seeing hydroponics being used almost on a household basis. Do you think that will start to form part of people's daily lives and the food they eat as well, or will people still try to gravitate towards food being farmed on the land?
Also an interesting question. And there's been a lot of hype about vertical farming, for example, as we know. I don't want to diss it. Vertical farming is fantastic for growing skunk. If you've got a very high value, low volume product, that's what you want to do. But for the great majority of what we eat, it's just too expensive. There's too much lighting, there's too much in the way of temperature control, there's too much built infrastructure to make it remotely viable. And unless you want food prices to be really high, it's very hard to see how it will be. And some people seem to be making a go with really high-end boutique salads delivered straight to smart restaurants, but that's not going to feed the world. And I think there's a danger of overhyping some of this stuff. We see something we like the look of, and we latch onto it and say that's the answer. And then you examine it a bit more carefully, and you say, that it just not in any way a universal answer. It might not even be a 0.1% answer. And I'm not dismissing any of this stuff out of hand. It should all be explored and investigated. But sometimes I feel the hype gets ahead of the technology.
No, of course, thank you.
Yeah.
Wow, brilliant. We're covering a lot of ground today, which is wonderful. And to change tack a little bit, over to Jack.
Hi George, I'm Jack, and until I moved back from London a few years ago, I was working in natural food retailing. For several years I've actually followed a plant-based diet, but I'm concerned about the rise of industrialised plant proteins in corporate, highly processed vegan foods. To me, it seems that plant-based eating should be focused on just that, eating unprocessed plants grown naturally. I found that over the last few years the quality of my diet's reduced, and I think that's likely due to the mainstream vegan products that are now on offer. Whilst I appreciate that consumers still have choice, how do you think we can move to a more sustainable plant-based diet while keeping it local, fresh, nutritious and fair for producers?
Thanks, Frank. Another great question, and it's one that troubles me a lot, because there is almost an inherent clash in what we're trying to do here. And I follow a plant-based diet as a sort of shortcut to reducing my environmental impacts. It's just it's a way in which you can say, we're using far less land here. The carbon opportunity costs are much lower. The ecological opportunity costs are much lower. So broadly speaking, it is much better to pursue a plant-based diet. Now, there can be all sorts of nuance further down the line on that, but at least you sort of can say, this makes it easy for me to know that I've got a pretty low impact. Now, we want, ideally, lots and lots of people to take this up, a plant-based or very nearly plant-based, but we know that huge numbers of people are subsisting on processed food, on food which isn't very good for us. Lots of people don't cook at all, and if you're going to have a good vegan diet, you really need to know how to cook, and you need to have the kitchen and the utensils and the knowledge and everything to cook it. So there are quite a lot of barriers there, and some of those barriers have been brought down by all sorts of new vegan foods which make it much, much easier to be plant-based. Being plant-based today is totally different to being plant-based 10 years ago, where you really did have to make everything from scratch and it was a struggle to get the ingredients. Now they're almost everywhere. So that's real progress. Not all of those things are good for us. There's a lot of ultra-processed food which goes by the name of vegan. But and we know ultra-processed food is bad. We're not quite sure still exactly why ultra-processed food is so bad for us. We just know that it is. There's a lot of biochemistry which is still to be resolved there. So people can easily reduce their environmental impacts, but it might not have the desired impact on their health if they're still in that arena of eating ultra-processed food. But at least it's a start, and hopefully we can start, once people have taken the initial step, edging them towards that healthier diet from rawer materials. But what we don't want to be in but what we don't want to be in is the missionary position, so to speak, which is I should explain this, which is basically lecturing people. You need to be better. You need to cook for yourself from raw ingredients, and how dare you not do this? I mean, loads of people. It's just a complete culture shock for a lot of people, and it is totally alien to their experience, but also to their skill set and their capacity. I mean, there are large numbers of homes without kitchens now, and a lot where people don't have the money to buy even quite basic kitchen equipment. And so, we've got to be really careful about not talking down to people here and not putting up further barriers to people changing diets. Now, this is where I become very interested in alternative proteins. I accept that your average plant-based burger is a bit of a nightmare, really. It's got sort of 30 ingredients, and you don't really don't want to look too hard at that ingredients list. But if you can produce a burger with the same impacts, that is basically meat but has never seen an animal, whose fundamental ingredient might be microbial protein, where you're reducing the land footprint, reducing the energy footprint, reducing the water footprint 100-fold, and instead of being the sort of broken down thing that ultra-processed food is, it's built up into meat, basically in the same way as it happens in an animal's body. Then you're getting all that reduction of impact without fundamentally changing the thing that people are eating. So, and also, we know that the great majority of people are not going to knowingly or voluntarily switch to a plant-based diet. So perhaps it's better, or as good, we should do it alongside that effort, is to gradually move the sources of what people are eating. So, I mean, these are huge questions. We could talk all day about how they're best resolved. By and large, I think it's a very good thing that plant-based eating has become much more accessible to people, but there is a potential health cost there. No greater health costs than people were carrying before when they're eating ultra-processed omnivorous food, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have the health shift alongside the environmental shift? And that's really that's the gold standard we should be aiming for. And if you look at the Eat Lancet report, for example, they show that on most criteria there's a convergence there, that what is good for the planet is good for us.
I totally agree with a lot of your points there about, it's great that we're seeing more people going down this plant-based or even vegan route. I mean, look at the numbers from Veganuary every year. I mean, it's sort of exponential growth, which is great. There's a lot more people thinking about what they're eating. And I thought it was really interesting the way you've sort of touched on people perhaps lacking the culinary skills to fully adopt a plant-based diet, and there's just not enough people sort of cooking at home. I think one of the other things that's potentially an issue is that when people are cooking at home, a lot of the go-to ingredients are things like avocados, rice, cashews, almonds, things that we don't or can't grow in this country very well. And I think that's another potential issue. And I've heard the argument many times, why are vegans eating avocados? That's not good for the planet. What do you think we could do better in terms of more local plant-based foods, proteins in particular, that are perhaps grown rather than made or manufactured?
Well, the first thing to say is that food miles has been greatly exaggerated as an environmental issue. There's a very interesting analysis by Our World in Data showing that you get a far greater environmental impact, reduction of your impact by changing your diet than by changing the location of your diet. So while particular things like avocados and almonds do have a very high impact, and you know, I avoid them myself for that reason, by and large, being a plant-based eater, wherever you're getting it from, has a much lower environmental impact than being an animal-based eater wherever you're getting it from. And you know, so often also there's a lot of fudging goes on. You know, I've got these local sausages, they come from just down the road. Yeah, but the pigs are fed on soya from Argentina. You're much better off just eating the soya from Argentina. That has a much lower environmental impact. And so you know, we shouldn't get completely hung up on the local thing. And there is some virtue in the argument of comparative advantage. You know, Britain is not at the moment a great place to grow pulses. Now, with better plant breeding, it might become a much better place to grow pulses, but it's difficult. We don't have enough sunshine hours to do really well with pulses, you know, except for broad beans. You know, the majority of them are hard to grow in bulk in this country and get the yields that you can get elsewhere. And so, you know, I'd love to see much more plant breeding effort going on to improve pulses for cool, temperate areas like ours. Mind you, with climate breakdown going the way it's going, we might just sit here and wait, and it'll all happen anyway. But so, you know, if it takes twice as much land to grow a ton of soybeans or lentils here than it does in Canada or Argentina, then actually the environmental argument is you should grow it in Canada or Argentina. But if you can grow products here which are comparable in terms of their land take as a function of yield, then yeah, absolutely, all other things being equal, it's better to eat locally. But all other things are not equal.
No, thank you.
Can I just jump in on this one? So, talking about animal-based proteins now, and talking about utilising the land that we can't use, for example, to grow the pulses and that over here, surely it is better in the UK and for food miles and like the carbon neutral and keeping it low impact, it would be better to utilise the uplands, for example, to graze cattle, but rotationally in with keeping it the ecosystems and working both systems together. Surely that will be a better way of keeping it natural. I know some people choose to be plant-based for their own reasons, which is completely fine, but surely as overall in the whole of the UK, for the whole of the UK to be lower on the carbon impact, that sometimes maybe utilising both those systems together and like we say, doing the regenerative and big arable farms, making a mixed farm, so putting your livestock on the land and bringing it all together, surely that would be a good way of...
Okay,
what's your thoughts on that?
So there are three big issues to do with livestock, particularly livestock on its own, which is what we're talking about in the uplands, because you know, you can't grow crops there. They are number one, land take, number two, carbon opportunity cost, and number three, ecological opportunity cost. So if we start with land take, by my calculations, and there aren't any official figures, but from what I can work out, lamb in the uplands occupies roughly 4 million hectares. That's almost as much as all the arable land in Britain, just for lamb. In fact, if an alien landed in the UK and said, what's the dominant life form here, they would quickly conclude it was the sheep. And because you know, livestock occupy 51% of our land.
Yeah.
And lamb, sheep occupy a very large proportion of that. And that 4 million hectares, in fact, plus all the lowland lamb as well, so the lamb here, equates to 1% of our diet. So it's a really, really low yield form of land use. Now, if we were to relax that land use and have more trees in the landscape, I mean, you'd have to bring your sheep down to below 5 per square kilometre to get tree regeneration coming back. Cattle, but probably below 2 per square kilometre, you're talking those yields becoming even lower, even lower. And even then, you wouldn't have the rich ecosystems that you would have if you didn't have those livestock there at all. So the western uplands of Britain, which in farming terms, the only thing you can do with them is to produce livestock, they were all once covered in rainforest, in temperate rainforest, defined as forest wet enough for epiphytes to grow, plants that grow on other plants. And this is the richest, potentially the richest ecosystem in Britain, is temperate rainforest. And it's confined now to a few tiny pockets, tiny little steep gorges that the sheep can't get into. And by continuing to keep sheep at any level, I mean, you know, at the moment in many of the uplands it's 1 sheep per hectare, 1 sheep per 2 hectares, 1 sheep per 5 hectares, hardly any sheep at all, but even so, enough to ensure that no trees regenerate, because they selectively nibble out the tree seedlings as they're so nutritious. And what you do by keeping those remarkably low levels of sheep there, you produce scarcely any meat, but you prevent the rainforest from returning. And with it, this remarkably rich and complex and dynamic ecosystem which could support a very wide range of life. So in my view, it's much, much better to allow those forests to return. They'll draw down carbon, that's the carbon opportunity cost. They'll allow much richer ecosystems to develop, that's the ecological opportunity cost. And so, you know, farming, let's farm where it makes sense to farm. Let's farm where there's a benign climate, like here, where the soils are reasonable, where you can do all sorts of interesting things, like you're doing here, the mixed farming going on here. To my mind, it just doesn't make any sense at all to be farming the bleak, blasted uplands. And it certainly doesn't make any commercial sense, because if you look at, for instance, the economics of sheep farming in Wales, it makes £0 per year on average. The average amount that sheep farming makes is £0. All the money comes from subsidies. It's only there because we, the taxpayer, are paying for it, and that doesn't make any sense to me at all. If we're going to be shelling out all that money, let's shell it out for ecological regeneration, not for keeping a sheep-wrecked, blasted ecological disaster zone.
So do you think that like public money for public goods, and for example in areas like this where mixed farming and the ecological systems work together, would be more beneficial for farmers in the UK to take advantage of, rather than, for example, farming up in the uplands?
Well, so the first thing to say is that the current farm subsidy system could not be better designed for maximum environmental destruction and social destruction and just about every perverse outcome you could possibly get. I mean, it's just crazy. And I'm a Remainer, a Eurosceptic Remainer, but you know, if I'd voted entirely on the farming issue, I would have voted Leave, because the Common Agricultural Policy is such a catastrophe. And it's caused the clearance of hundreds of thousands of hectares, because you get paid for land that's in agricultural condition. It doesn't matter if you're producing anything on it or not, it just has to look like it's used for production, which means bare. So if there's wildlife habitat on your land, they put a red ring round it and saying that land is ineligible for subsidies. They call wildlife habitat a permanent ineligible feature. And so what do? You clear that wildlife habitat in order to make the land eligible. And I've seen, for instance, in Transylvania, Romania, huge tracts of the most beautiful wood pasture, meadows, woodlands, incredible habitat full of wolves, lynx, bears, cuckoos flying around in flocks because there's so many of them, golden orioles, black woodpeckers, you name it, all being cleared solely to qualify for subsidies under the Common Agricultural Policy. So in principle, the ELMS scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which the government's intending to bring in, public payments for public goods, in principle, that would be a major improvement. However, what we're already seeing in this country is complete regulatory collapse. We've seen the Environment Agency, Natural England, Rural Payments Agency and their equivalent agencies in the other 3 nations totally unable to do their jobs because all their funding has been cut, they've lost huge numbers of staff, their morale is at rock bottom. How are they going to monitor and enforce a system which demands that every farm is checked to make sure it is actually doing environmental land management. I mean, they can't even do basic cross compliance at the moment. It's just not working. So the idea that, you know, we're going to scale that up unless we have 10 times the budget for those regulators, it's going to be a total farce. And the government is insisting, even when we have the most egregious breaches, like the pollution of rivers, wiping out all the life in those rivers, insisting that the Environment Agency takes a voluntary approach and talks nicely to the farmer and says, please don't keep pouring your slurry into the river. Whereupon the farmer says, ha, sod off. And you know, unless you're going to monitor, unless you're going to enforce, unless you're going to uphold the law, which the government doesn't seem terribly keen on doing at the moment, then it's going to be a farce. And basically, it's going to be a continuation of the basic payment scheme where if you've got the land, you get paid for it. And the more land you have, the more money you're going to be given. So on paper, it looks like a big improvement. I dread to know how it's going to work out in practice. I don't know if the rest of you's got views on that.
Great. Time is running out, and as the beef and sheep farmer in the room, I'm starting to get a bit twitchy now. But I'll swallow that for a while, George, and do that another day. We've got 4 last questions from people who can't be with us today. So they've texted and emailed in. So Lucy, you've got one from a friend of yours.
Yes, you have kind of just touched on this topic, but I'll still ask it. This is from my friend Poppy, who's a recent zoology graduate. Coming in from a plant-based point of view again, she would like to know whether you think converting more pasture land to arable cropping would be beneficial, ecologically speaking, and practical. Like, do you think that's achievable? And if not for cropping, what other uses do you see that land being put to?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, as you say, there's in many places you just can't make that conversion sensibly. You know, if you start trying to plough up the land, all that's going to happen is the soil washes straight off into the nearest river, and your yields are going to be really low, and it won't be worth the diesel that you're using to get the crops off the field. And so I'm definitely not saying let's turn livestock land into arable unless it's in a place where it really makes sense to be doing arable or mixed rotational or something different. In the majority of cases, I think in the UK that's not going to be the case, and it's really is a choice between livestock and rich ecosystems. And I know where I come down.
Yeah. Just following on from that, I really agree with rewilding. I think it's brilliant, but do you not have the worry that by reducing the amount of land we can farm on, we are exporting our food productions to other countries and exporting the problems that comes with that and the impact on the environment to somewhere which may have lower animal welfare standards or lower environmental care?
Well, I would worry if we were rewilding large amounts of productive land, but the land I'm talking about is so comically unproductive. I mean, it really makes absolutely no sense at all to be farming it, and people aren't really farming it. I mean, they're keeping some sheep on there in order to harvest farm subsidies. That's the economics of it. You know, it's subsidy harvesting, and so it's so minimal. It's not even a rounding error. You know, if you were to take 10, 20, 30% of that land where you've got 1 sheep per 2 hectares and rewild it, no one would feel the impact of that at all. And especially, you know, if people in this country are simultaneously switching towards a plant-based diet, and we're doing so faster than I think than any other country on earth at the moment, we're making that switch, then at the same time you're actually reducing your global land take. And part of the problem here is that, you know, you look at where people of your age are, and you're eating a diet which is very different to the diet of your parents or grandparents at your age. And yet we're being told constantly by farmers, you've got to be eating our produce. In fact, farmers are the only commercial sector I've ever come across which attacks its customers for changing their tastes. It's crazy stuff. You know, how dare you not eat our lamb? Sorry, but we're not eating lamb anymore. We don't like it anymore. We don't want it. We want something completely different. And it's you know, there's a lot of crazy talk about sort of these ungrateful millennials not eating our produce. You know, do you really want us to stick with the 1950s diet? Because basically that's what we're growing in this country, is a 1950s diet. and people have moved on from that. So, you know, we just got to be sensible and strategic about this and say, right, you know, where we can grow the food that people want to eat, let's grow it. Where we can't grow the food that people want to eat, let's stop. Let's stop, and let's not just mess up the ecosystem for no good reason.
Increasingly twitchy in my chair, George.
I bet you are, yeah.
Just to rebalance that maybe slightly, as a seller of beef and lamb, our customers are increasingly seeking out well-produced and sustainable beef and lamb that's full of nutrition. And I think I'm also hearing behind there might be a role for that type of meat in the diet. And
well, I mean, within the sector, there is a shift taking place as to the kind of production that people want. And hopefully there's a continuing decline. You know, if people are going to eat meat, eat very small quantities and eat well-produced meat. I think one of the dangers is that so all the celebrity chefs and food writers are saying, oh, everyone should eat pasture-fed meat, which would be great if we had 8 more planets, because, you know, this takes an awful lot of land. I mean, pasture is 82% of all farmland is pasture already. And if we want everyone to start eating pasture, to switch away from eating KFC and start eating pasture-fed meat, I mean, how's that going to work? It's just, you know, we don't have the land.
So if I could show you that we can increase stocking rates by managing grassland better through holistic grazing practices and a pasture for life approach, would you be a little bit more positive? Because we can do that.
I would have to examine the case very carefully, because so many crazy claims have been made which don't check out, and the classic example being Alan Savory's TED Talk, which has been viewed about 14 trillion times, and he says we can suck down all the carbon dioxide that's ever been produced by doing this holistic thing. And when I asked him, okay, where are the scientific sources for this, he was unable to name any of them. In fact, he couldn't produce a single scientific paper to support any of the contentions in his TED Talk that I asked him about. So we have to be really cautious about this stuff. You know, if we start making claims that aren't supported by the science, all that does is undermine any good thing that we're trying to do. So we have to be really careful to define our terms. What do we mean by holistic? What do we mean by regenerative? And any other terms that we might use. If we have defined that carefully, can we now have good sound science which then measures the impacts of that and sees whether the claims that are being made stand up or not? Because I've just seen too much bullshit, so to speak, in this field, and I think we just have to be really, really clear about getting the facts right.
I agree. We need more evidence, and I can assure you that is coming through the system, and we'll share more of that with you over the next year or so. You mentioned bullshit. There's a question here from Bertel, a young friend of ours who works in the food and drink sector. How can we build soil fertility without utilising animal manures in a circular economy?
So another great question, and we know that rotational mixed rotational farming can build soil fertility, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this farm and why I've come here for the second time to look at what you're doing. But we also now know that there are other ways of doing it as well. So another farm I've been visiting, not very far from here, about 30-40 miles from here, which is horticulture. It's 17 acres, run by Ian Tolhurst Organics near Pangbourne. He's been building soil fertility steadily for 33 years, and there's good data to demonstrate it, without any inputs at all, except for 0.7 millimeters of wood chip every 7 years. And the wood chip is an inoculant, not a fertilizer, which stimulates activity of fungi and bacteria in the soil, unlocking nutrients, which at the same time are being drawn up from deep down by deep-rooted weeds with which he's rotating his vegetables. And it's just a really interesting demonstration of how you can build fertility without livestock. Now, the problem, which could also be a problem for mixed rotational, is can you transfer that to arable at scale and at the same time make a profit? And probably not is the answer there, because the margins for arable are so tight, unless you can find niche markets, which I know you're doing here. But generally into the mass market, they're so tight that you're right on the edge all the time anyway. And if you have to put aside certain amounts of land for your rotation, then that can make it economically inviolable. Of course, exactly the same thing can happen doing a mixed rotation with livestock. So there's lots of questions here. Some people try to resolve those questions by saying, well, food should be more expensive. And from the farmer's point of view, of course, farmers would love food to be more expensive. And there are ways, selling into niche markets, where you can make food more expensive. But if food were generally more expensive, bearing in mind that the price of grain is set globally, not nationally, a lot more people would go hungry, because the primary determinant of hunger is poor people not being able to afford food. So, you know, let's not fantasize ourselves too far down that road.
Okay, thank you. And that speaks nicely to Maddie's question, who's currently studying sustainable development at uni. Can we scale up regenerative farming?
So another great question. All these are fantastic questions, and thank you, Maddie and everyone. There is potentially a clash here, because regenerative farming does generally need a lot of care, quite a lot of labour. And it seems so far to work well at small scale. That doesn't mean it's impossible to scale up, especially if we start deploying some interesting forms of Agritech. And I know, you know, a lot of people instinctively buck against that, because they say, well, regenerative farming, you know, it doesn't look like the farming where you deploy robots to weed your crops or whatever it might be. It's, you know, the crude caricature, I know, but you know, well, maybe it can look like that. And you know, what I'm interested in are the end results. And you know, let's have those tight definitions of regenerative farming. And so obviously they would include, is the soil improving? The structure, the functional ecology of the soil improving? Is it being kept on the land when it was previously being lost or degraded? Are we polluting the water source or not? Are we stopping that? Are we storing carbon or are we losing carbon? Are we allowing parts of the ecosystem to flourish? We'll never allow a full ecosystem to flourish in farming, because the whole point of farming is you're rolling back the ecosystem in order to shape the land for human consumption. But you know, are we going some way down that road? And if the answer is yes to that, I don't care very much what the scale is. Obviously, I want to see as many people employed on the land as possible, and by and large, the bigger your scale, the lower your employment per hectare. So that is an issue. But you know, if you're talking about, for instance, large-scale arable, the ratio is going to be pretty much the same right the way along the line. That if you employ more than a certain amount of people per bushel of wheat, then you're not going to make a profit. And so you have to be pretty high tech if you're going to survive in that market. And so I don't see any inherent barrier to regenerative being large scale, but there might be some practical barriers that we bump into as we try to scale it up.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And the final question for today, this whole debate, incredibly complex, we've covered an awful lot of ground between us. What podcasts, Twitter feeds, sources would you go to for data and to keep up to date and to help us break down these barriers? And are we all in this echo chamber? How do we? How do these young folk get into this subject?
Yeah, I'm afraid you're asking the wrong person, because I'm just this uber nerd who spends my whole life with my nose stuck in scientific papers, and I'll start the day saying, oh, I've only got 30 papers to read today, I can get through it. And then at the end of the day, I'll have read 30 papers and I'll still have 30 papers to read, because each one has led to another paper that I need to read. And so what I'm trying to do is, from this vast amount of material, this huge amount of data, trying to make sense of this fantastically complex system that we call food production. And it's it would be 10 lifetimes work even to get anywhere close to it. So I can only skate over the surface, but I'm trying to dig those skates in as far as I can. And it's one thing I can say is that it's a constantly evolving field. Something which seemed like a certainty last year is overturned the following year. I mean, just soil ecology, for instance, which is horribly neglected. But finally, in the last few months, there's been a whole new slew of papers published on it, which have really transformed our understanding of what the soil is and how it works. It obviously wasn't treated as important before. Yeah. Who cares? It's only the basis of our entire lives. But now suddenly people are tuning in to saying what exactly is going on in the rhizosphere, what exactly is going on in the drylosphere, what exactly is happening in that interaction between fungi and bacteria and plant roots and the rest of it. It's really fantastic. It's absolutely fascinating. But you virtually need a PhD just to understand the papers. I've got a background in ecology, and I really have been struggling, with some of this, because you need the chemistry, you need the statistics, you need all sorts of skills that I haven't got just to understand. So I've been reading those papers very slowly. Yeah. But watch this space, and hopefully we'll try to make sense of what I've been learning.
Yeah, great. I'm going to draw it to a close. We're all burning in the crazy September sunshine right now. George, thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks very
Lots
much.
of food for thought, lots of depth, and great debate. Panel, thank you. It's up to you now. You need to get out there and make a difference and save us oldies. George and I, we're at the end of our careers. It's up to you now. Come on. Go well. Hopefully see you all again here at FarmEd soon.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The production of this podcast was funded by the Farming the Future Coronavirus Emergency Response Fund. Thank you to the A-Team, Roddick, Samworth and 30 Percy Foundations for your support.